Chapter 7, Off to Pain and More of the Same. After my little getting fired meeting with Rich D. Martini that afternoon, I moved quickly to get another job in the industry. I called up Payne Weber, another prestigious brokerage house, made an appointment for a job interview, did the interview, and got the job. Again, I was always good at getting the job. I just wasn't good at keeping the job, if you get my drift. I don't remember anything about that particular interview except that the manager and I both had East Coast roots. He Philadelphia and me New Jersey. So that may have had something to do with me getting hired because we just hit it off right away. Actually, my new boss and I became pretty good friends as we both lived in the same neighborhood and totally related to each other and truly liked one another. I do remember sitting in his office one time discussing his story, and I remember him mentioning to me that he had become a millionaire in his 20s or something like that, but I don't know how or why that came up. He was no question the real deal and a very sharp guy. Maybe by mentioning that millionaire thing, he was enticing me to work hard so that my result might be the same, but I wasn't the type to be tricked into working. So another very good company name on my business card, but I was still that same guy, that same mess of a man just underneath the fine wool of that Brooks Brothers suit. I mean, hell, I hadn't changed one iota, so why should the results have been any different? And they weren't. Same old, same old. I was still that same old leopard my dad used to refer to, whose spots weren't about to change, not anytime soon anyway. New office, new boss, new business card, same guy, same crappy attitude, same alcoholic who couldn't make it past Division Street without stopping for a drink or 20. I was that same negligent, lousy, lazy, cut corners employee. Anyone with a brain could have predicted that I would not have had a positive result at Payne Weber and that any sort of success just wouldn't be in the cards. It was really just more of the same except for the details, and more of the same would rear its ugly head in the form of a very poorly executed securities trade. As I may have mentioned prior, as a stockbroker, it's imperative that you do things by the book, and there are reasons for that. If you don't do things by the book, you can get your tit caught in that proverbial old ringer, and on this particular occasion, I surely got my little old tit caught in that proverbial old ringer. Simply put, my negligence came back to haunt me. I mean, let's face it, it was simply the fact that I was just being Brad, and that just wasn't a good thing. The tit in the ringer story goes something like this. As I had mentioned prior, I didn't do business by the book, and that can get you in big trouble in that business. The problem arose when I did an options trade with an old high school friend of mine. When you trade options in a customer's account, you're supposed to have money in that account, and that's because option trades are extremely risky and everything happens very fast. Options trades settle the next day, meaning you must have money in the account the following day, whereas in a stock trade, settlement is 3 days. With options, you should, for all practical purposes, have funds in the account prior to the trade. And after reading this, you'll understand why. So this good friend of mine from high school calls me and he wants to trade some stock options. So I'm like, sure, so-and-so, let's do it, buddy. So we start trading options in his account. And within 2 or 3 days, he was down $20,000. And even though he hadn't put money in his account to cover the $20,000 loss, I figured that since he's an old friend, he'll be good for it. Boy, was I wrong. Not only did he not pay what he owed, the $20,000, but he disappeared. I never spoke with him again, in fact. I tried to find him, and I was told that he had gone skiing to Utah. Holy crap, he fucked me over. I couldn't do something like that to a high school friend, could you? Plus, I was to blame because funds should have been in the account to start with. Like I had mentioned prior, the options market is very fast and very risky, and to do a trade, there must be enough funds in the account, or something like this could happen. So when the dust settled, I was told by the branch manager, my back east buddy, that Payne Weber would be taking the $20,000 in installments out of my monthly check. What my old high school friend had done was actually considered a crime of some sort, and in fact, one day a bunch of guys in suits came into the office, and I was told that they were detectives of some sort, and that trade was the reason. Not sure. I later heard through the grapevine that my ex-friend actually was forced to pay it off, but I wasn't to be around long enough to witness that. As luck would have it, I would never have to take responsibility for that particular mishap. And in fact, looking back, I rarely had to take responsibility for my many mishaps. I was a cat with 9 lives, but we all know that one could dodge bullets for only so long. Eventually, the behavior catches up with you, but not this time. This time, I would land on my feet once again, and here's how. Not long after the $20,000 fiasco, I was called into my manager's office, and he tells me to have a seat, and then proceeds to inform me that he would be leaving PaineWebber, as he had been offered a branch manager position at another brokerage house. As I look back, I realized that he could have just left without telling me, but I guess he respected me enough to let me know that he was leaving. After he told me that, I responded with, "Can you take me with you?" And his response was exactly this: "Yes, Brad, I'll take you with me, but leave the roller skates at home." I swear to God, that's exactly what he said. I mean, who would make that up? So I lucked out once again. I had dodged yet another bullet. I was off the hook, and within a few days, I was off to another brokerage house by the name of A.G. Becker. It was to be my final stop as a stockbroker. I wonder to this day if my back east buddy left PaineWebber because of that trade that I had done. It's highly possible. End of chapter. Chapter 8, the Lolita story. You know, when I was a stockbroker, I liked everything about the job except for the actual work. I liked dressing up in a Brooks Brothers suit. I liked wearing a shirt right out of the cleaners. I liked the right tie. I liked the right new shiny black shoes. I liked the way I looked, and I liked the way I felt. I liked the image that I portrayed. I felt like a big shot, even though I was anything but. I was such a good actor that I even fooled myself. I actually thought that I was some big successful guy. But in actuality, I owned nothing. I had no money in the bank, and I was lousy at my job. But that didn't stop me. I looked good, I looked successful, and even believed that I was successful. And because of that, I think others believed it too, just looking at me. And as far as picking up a girl in a bar on Division Street, I didn't have to because they picked me up. Anyway, one day after work, I'm drinking alone at a sort of French-style stand-up bar right off of Division Street, which is Chicago's version of Party Town, and where everybody meets for a cocktail or 10 after work. And I'm standing there having my drink and minding my own business when the waiter approaches me and says, "Excuse me, sir, the lady over there asked me to give you this." And it was a cocktail napkin with a kiss mark on it. I mean a real kiss mark from her lipstick lips. And under the kiss mark was written something in French like, "Mon chéri amour." And so I looked over to where he was pointing, and lo and behold, standing there was the hottest girl I'd ever seen looking at me and smiling. So I went over to her and we introduced ourselves. And eventually we ended up getting turned on and wanting each other. So we headed over to my place and did what was natural. And she ended up sleeping over, and I was head over heels. What can I say? Anyway, we ended up going out for several weeks or so until she decided to move to L.A. to become a movie star. Her name, by the way, was, and I'm sure still is, Lolita Davidovich. You may have heard of her as she starred opposite Paul Newman in a movie called Blaze, which I didn't become privy to until around 7 years later in 1990 when laying around my apartment in Bangkok, recuperating from a very serious motorcycle accident, which I had recently had. Lolita was working mostly as a lingerie model for companies like Sears and doing very well at it. And in her off hours, she studied acting. And as a matter of fact, I remember she came over to my place one night, and she had a book with her, a play if I'm not mistaken. And she gives me one part to read, and she read her part, and she wanted to work on her acting skills. And that little scene that I did with her was my very first exposure to acting. And I mention that because not long after meeting Lolita, I would quit the brokerage business and start modeling and studying acting myself in Chicago. Anyway, I really fell in love with her. And with yours truly, love sort of meant control, or better yet, own. And so I got it in my head one day that we needed to get more serious about this relationship of ours and start seeing more of each other from now on, and maybe even live together. And so I called her up, and I was just about to lay down the law, but before I could get a word out, she said to me something like, "Brad, I was just about to call you and tell you that my agent and I are moving to Hollywood next week to attempt to make it in the acting business, so I won't be seeing you anymore." And I was like, "Huh?" Well, so much for my ownership of this very sexy new lady in my life, who in about 5 minutes was going to be out of my life. I really don't remember a whole lot of details about our relationship, but I do remember that we went to Michigan one time, maybe to the beach for some sort of holiday type deal. And when we returned, we went to a Simon & Garfunkel concert at Comiskey Park, where the Chicago White Sox play. And I looked up the date of that concert, and it was July 24th, 1983. So that's when all of this took place. Oh, and by the way, what a concert it was. I found out that day that Simon & Garfunkel certainly weren't overrated whatsoever, and in fact took my breath away. So that was that. Well, Until a few months later, anyway, and you won't believe this part of the story. Shit, I can hardly believe it myself as I type these words out almost 40 years after the fact. As I had mentioned prior, right after I quit the brokerage business, I myself started modeling in Chicago, and I pretty much had success right off the bat. I mean, I went to a few castings for print ads, and I got them, and those ended up being full-page ads in the Chicago Tribune, for Christ's sakes. What an ego trip for a phony like me. Anyway, one day, I arrived at a studio to do a modeling job for Sears, which in those days was the biggest retail in Chicago, if not the United States. And when I got to the set, there were two bicycles standing there, one for me and one for the female model that hadn't shown up yet. So we're all just sitting around waiting for the female model to show up, as she was a bit late. And she finally shows up, and to my great shock and disbelief, it's Lolita Davidovich herself, back from LA for a visit and doing a modeling job with me. I mean, think about it. What are the odds of this happening? When she left Chicago for LA, I was a stockbroker with no intention of quitting that job, and a few months later, we're doing the modeling job together. The man upstairs, no doubt, had this all planned out. So anyway, we took our positions on the bikes, and the photographer begins shooting away. And Lolita looks at me smiling and says to me something like, "I told you this was easy money." She may not recall much of this, but I can assure you but that's pretty much the way it went down. And Lolita, in case you ever happen to stumble across this book, you may look at this as kiss and tell and in bad taste on my part, but I don't. Far from it, in fact. I look at it as just being human. Of course, in my case, I don't really give a rat's ass what people or society think of me. I care about what I think of me. And by the way, it's not all that highly. End of chapter. Chapter 9. Over to A.G. Becker and out. Anyway, like I said, I followed my Paine-Webber boss to another brokerage house by the name of A.G. Becker, but unfortunately I was that same leopard with those same spots, that same alcoholic, that same mess of a man. Not to mention that I was totally lazy and had no intention of putting in the work that was required to be successful in that business. Well, it sure wouldn't take a rocket scientist to predict what the outcome would be. I mean, I certainly wasn't going to become employee of the month anytime soon, that's for sure. I would be that same crappy employee that I had been with Dean Witter and with Paine-Webber. Nothing would change except the name of the company that I bragged about drunk. Again, I looked and acted like a successful broker. So there I was as usual, getting drunk in a bar in Division Street and looking like that handsome top executive that I wasn't. And just maybe some sexy thing would get turned on and simply have to have me. As I had done in my last two stops, I would arrive at the office at 9 a.m. and leave at 3 p.m. Those were the hours of the New York Stock Exchange, and those were my hours too, which, by the way, was ridiculous. I mean, just because the New York Stock Exchange opened at 10 and closed at 4 New York time, which is 3 Chicago time, what the hell did that have to do with me? I was a registered representative working for a company who was in the business of selling securities to investors, so I should have been on the phone cold calling to get customers until 5 p.m. every day, like everyone else in the office, and everyone else on planet Earth for that matter. Basically, all I did while I was in the office was socialize with the other brokers and try to have as good a time as I possibly could without doing a lick of work. I mean, if a guy is a salesman on, say, straight commission, by the end of the quarter, some higher up in the company would see that this guy had done nothing because his sales would be zero or close to it, and the gig would be up, and he'd be fired. When I would start working at these companies, there would be that grace period that I had mentioned where I would make a salary for the first few months being new with the company. But with all three of those brokerage houses that I had worked for, I never had any longevity. Hence, I was always new. I would have been found out had I stayed anywhere for any amount of time, but I never did. Obviously, booze was the main reason for my lack of success, but come on, Brad, don't kid yourself. You were also just plain old lazy. I worked for just a few months at A.G. Becker before I had apparently finally had enough, and the decision to quit that final brokerage job was sort of spiritual, you could say, and came out of nowhere. When I left for work that morning, I had no thought or intention of quitting that job that day. None. I'll never forget the image of that last day. I can still see it. At around 3 in the afternoon, I just started to walk around the office almost as if in a trance, like I wasn't a part of it. And as I was slowly walking around the office, I was just looking at all the other brokers in their little glass offices as they were picking their noses or brushing off dandruff, talking on the phone with their fat stomachs and ugly expressions. And as I was taking it all in, I asked myself, do I really want to be that guy 10 years from now? And the answer was a definitive no, I did not. I kid you not, that little scenario actually took place exactly as I just described it, and I remember it like it was yesterday. It was probably the first honest thing that I had done since becoming a stockbroker. I was for the first time being honest with myself. The other thing worth mentioning is that my branch manager friend who had brought me with him from Payne Weber had left the company a few days prior, and that may have had something to do with this apparent metamorphosis of mine. Not sure. I was never privy to exactly why he left because he never told me. I'm guessing that he got there, didn't like it, so he left. I'll never know. I'll never know, but I do know this. The new branch manager didn't like me, as he probably saw right through me. And so after my little hypnotic episode, I walked into the new manager's office ready to inform him that I was leaving. And before I could get the words out of my mouth, he says to me, "Brad, from now on, you will not exit this office before 5 p.m. No more leaving at 3. Understand?" It was weird. I go in to quit, and before I can say anything, he lays down the law. He had probably been looking at my sales figures, and my little everyday act didn't fool him one bit. Anyway, my reply to him was that I had actually come into his office to resign, and he was taken aback, and he asked me what I was planning on doing. And for some reason, I told him that I was going to Hollywood. I was actually referred to as Hollywood by the other brokers in the office, so maybe that's why I came up with that. Not sure, but that's what I said. I had no intention of going to Hollywood, by the way. I mean, why would I? Anyway, it was such a strange ending to that career. I came in like a superficial lion and went out like a "what the hell am I doing here" lamb. It's a bit ironic, but around 10 years, 2 wives, and 5 countries later, I would end up living right off of Hollywood Boulevard for real with my then Nicaraguan wife, Miriam. Go figure. Here's that building that I worked in while in the employ of A.G. Becker. My kind of building, what can I say? End of chapter. Chapter 10. I was a lousy stockbroker. To sum it up, I was a lousy stockbroker, and the reasons were plain and simple. I was still drinking, I was lazy, I didn't like the work, and I cut corners. Voila. Excuse me. I liked the image of being a stockbroker, the suit, the nice office, the business card that read Dean Ritter Reynolds with my name on it, and the fact that I could impress chicks that I was attempting to pick up in bars on Division Street with the fact that I worked for an elite company in a posh office. In other words, I liked playing the part of a successful stockbroker, but I just didn't like that actual day-to-day work that it would take to become a successful stockbroker. Go figure. When a new broker starts out, he gets paid a salary for a certain period of time, a so-called grace period, if you will, during which time he or she is supposed to make cold calls and attempt to bring in new customers and build up his so-called customer book. If a new broker isn't doing that, his numbers will basically remain at 0, and when that grace period is over, he'd most likely be let go. As I said, I was lazy, and cold calls were very hard work and no fun at all as far as I was concerned. You might even say they were a form of torture. It was a very, very unpleasant task for a guy like me. Allow me to describe what making a cold call is all about. There were a few large books in the office, for example, The Manufacturer's Guide of Chicago, or something to that effect. And we'd have to open the book, call one of the companies listed in it, ask for so-and-so, and try to sell him some stocks or bonds or some such investment. First of all, most people who are at work generally don't like receiving sales calls from strangers. I mean, for instance, I'd make a cold call to a guy at his workplace, and I'd ask for Mr. So-and-so, and he'd get on and say something like, "Hi, this is John. What can I do for you?" "Hi, John. My name is Brad Kerner, and I'm a stockbroker with Dean Witter." And more often than not, he'd be furious, and he'd interrupt me right in the middle of my sentence and say, "How the hell did you get my number? Don't you ever call me here again." And then he'd hang up. Making cold calls all day, every day is an ugly job, to put it mildly. I'd say that during the entire time that I worked at Dean Witter, I turned very few, if any, cold calls into an order, albeit I didn't make many in the first place. They were simply too painful for a guy like me. I did do some business with family and with a few connections that I made here and there, but my father, for instance, had a broker already, and he was satisfied with him. Plus, I'm not sure he trusted me all that much to handle his investments. I mean, you could say that my track record with him wasn't so hot. The only new business that I ever did was when I was what is referred to in the business as broker of the day. Let me define for you broker of the day. Each broker at Dean Witter, or any other brokerage firm for that matter, gets the opportunity once or twice a month to be what's known as the broker of the day, which means that all of the calls that come into Dean Witter's office that day, where the person calling doesn't already have a broker, are directed to the broker of the day. I love being broker of the day because I actually got to do some selling for a change. So I did get some new customers when I worked as broker of the day. The other thing that bears mentioning is this. In the stockbroker business, you really had to do things by the book. If you didn't, you'd end up getting your proverbial old tit caught in a ringer. But of course, being the lazy, hungover guy that I usually was, I cut corners and did things that were not kosher, so to speak, to get my sales numbers up. And cutting corners and not doing things by the book would eventually get me in real trouble more than once. I didn't have many customers, so I used to make the most out of the few that I had. In one case, which I described here, which I will describe to you, I'm ashamed of myself to this day, and I mean that. It's a part of my past that I regret, but there's nothing that I can do about it, so I have to live with it. When you screw somebody in life, especially if it's a kind little old lady, you have to live with that. They get hurt, but so do you, because you have to live with those bad deeds on your conscience for the rest of your life. Do you know that I still feel guilty about what I did to this person some 40 years later? It's not a pretty story, and I hate having to recall it here, but it's pertinent, and it will give you an idea of the kind of stockbroker, and for that matter, the kind of man that I was. I had worked as a stockbroker of the day. I worked broker of the day one day, and an 80-year-old woman called into Dean Witter's office for the first time and says I was broker of the day. The call came to me, which ended up being bad luck for her. I actually still remember her name, but I won't reveal it here. She had money and was a very with-it old lady. Her son was a physician, but really didn't have the time to take care of his mother's investments, so he let her do it. That first call, I had sold her some Commonwealth Edison stock, which was a very conservative and appropriate investment in her case, as it paid a big dividend and was not considered a risky investment whatsoever. We ended up doing some subsequent transactions, and she started to trust me as I had put her in conservative and appropriate investments. Let me interject here a bit. There are a few rules that brokers are supposed to follow, and one of those is Rule 405, otherwise known as the Know Your Customer Rule. It essentially states that you have to get to know your customer so that you know what type of investment is appropriate for that particular customer. By the way, an 80-year-old woman should only be buying conservative and non-risky investments such as government bonds, which are guaranteed and at that time paid a fairly high interest rate. There's little to no risk with such an investment, and appropriate in this type of situation. I've gotten the following info from the website lawinfo.com that explains Rule 405 better than I can. Due diligence rule. Stockbrokers who are recommending that a client buy or sell a security that is traded on the New York Stock Exchange must comply with NYSE Rule 405. Rule 405 requires stockbrokers to use due diligence to learn the essential facts relative to every customer, every order. Rule 405 does not explain what is essential, however. Other guidance from the New York Stock Exchange suggests that information such as age, financial status, and investment objectives are essential pieces of information. Some stockbrokers are paid a commission for every product that they sell. The commissions vary from product to product and can create a conflict of interest between the stockbroker's own interests and those of the client. Therefore, it is important to make sure that your investment advisor or stockbroker understands your financial status and investment objectives and tries to further your objectives every single time a transaction is made on your behalf. Otherwise, you may be making unwise investments and your stockbroker may be violating important ethical rules. Okay, I'm speaking again. In other words, you don't take big risks such as options trading in the account of an elderly lady who really just wants a decent return on her money with little to no risk. I want to point out to you that my actions were not premeditated or on purpose. I just did what came natural at the time and had no intention of screwing anyone, which is exactly what ended up happening. After those first few investments with this kind elderly woman, I thought it would be a good idea to open a discretionary account for her. A discretionary account is a type of account where the broker doesn't need the client's permission to make a trade or buy a security, if you will. It would allow me to trade in her account without asking her permission, so if some good investment came along out of the blue, I could buy it without having to call her and get her permission. So I mentioned it to her that it might be to her advantage if she came in and signed a discretionary account form so that I could just buy and sell in her account as I saw fit. Well, since she trusted me at this point, she agreed and came down to the office and signed the form. Again, I want to point out here that writing this story is a difficult task because I don't want to have to remember it, and I sure don't want to have to report it what a snake I was, but it's pertinent. So anyway, soon after she signed the agreement, I started buying and selling stock options in her account. Well, options trading is extremely risky and a totally inappropriate investment for this little old lady. Options move very quickly, and one has to be really on top of it, an expert, if you will. And that I certainly wasn't, and in fact, I was a beginner. After a while, I was constantly buying and selling options in her account on a daily or even hourly basis, and in the process, losing quite a bit of her capital. And by the way, every time I did a trade, I got a commission, and I did a lot of trades. So the bottom line is that I was making a lot of money while she was losing a lot of money. This type of trading that I was doing in her account is called churning. Churning is when a broker trades often in a client's account just for the purpose of making commissions. I got the following regarding churning from Investopedia. Churning is a term applied to the practice of a broker conducting excessive trading in a client's account mainly to generate commissions. Churning is an unethical and an illegal practice that violates SEC Rules 15C17 and security laws. Okay, so I was doing both inappropriate trades and also churning in her account, two no-nos. I have never had to pay a price for this because I was fired before it had come to light. But I'm sure it eventually did, and that nice old lady who gave me her trust, I screwed. And I've had to live with that all these years and still do. I'm pretty sure Esther is gone by now, but I'm not. And I have to live with what I did to that very kind and trusting old lady. Lastly, in a nutshell, the following was my typical day as a stockbroker. I'd get up, shit, shower, and shave, put on my Navy summer weight wool Brooks Brothers suit, fall in love with myself in the mirror, put on my skates, elevator down and out the building, skate down State Street to the best neighborhoods in all of Chicago, the Gold Coast, then over to stunning Michigan Avenue, then all the way down Michigan Avenue and over to the Chicago River and on into the Loop, and then to Dean's office, which was a brand spanking new dynamite building. All the better for that superficial stockbroker that I happen to be. It made me feel like $1 million every time I glided in. Anyway, I'd arrive at the office on my skates at around 8:30 a.m., and then I'd shoot the breeze with a few of my buddies there, make a few social-type phone calls, act busy, and then around 11:30 I'd go to lunch with my fellow drinking buddy broker, and we'd go to this very nice outdoor cafe, drink our lunch, and then stumble back into the office, where I would proceed to get nothing done all afternoon. And then when the New York Stock Exchange closed at 3 p.m. Chicago time, I'd leave the office, get on my skates, and head back home the same way I came. There was one small, tiny little problem with this scenario, and that was the fact that to get back to my rented condo in the Gold Coast, I had to skate across that infamous street called Division Street. If you happen to be from Chicago, you'd know all about Division Street because of its bars and famous nightlife. It's a street that is all bars, and I did all that I could do to skate right on past that there Division Street and go home, but to no avail. I could never get that past that there Division Street without stopping for a few. And by the way, I never just drank a few. Alcoholics don't have that ability. We drink until either the bar closes or we get kicked out for being an asshole. Myself, anyway. So I'd skate to Division Street, take off my skates, don my expensive, fashionable wingtip shoes, and hit my favorite watering hole. And by the way, in those days, the 80s, everybody was snorting coke for recreation, even guys in suits like me. And so when I'd go into that bar, I'd hit the men's room straight away and into a stall, take out that little vial of coke that I had on the inside pocket of my suit coat, unscrew the cap that had a tiny little spoon attached, snort a couple of those tiny little spoonfuls of coke, and then make my way back to the bar where I would proceed to order my first of many beers. And then, of course, I'd be on the prowl for a sexy female that I could take back to my room for some of that good old-fashioned sex with a stranger type of thing that I like so much. I was a virtual pickup artist and was indeed very skilled at that endeavor, the picking up of girls, that is. My best friend at Dean Witter was a guy named Dan, and he and I would hit a watering hole on occasion. And I remember what he said to me one time. He said, "Brad, I like going out drinking with you so I can try to get one of those girls that you turned down." He did say that. Not exactly sure what he meant, but most likely that I was a real pro when it came to getting a cute girl back to my room. Hell, I was motivated. I was never motivated in my work at Dean Witter. You could sum up my career like this. I looked the part, I played the part, and in fact loved playing the part, but I didn't do the work. I talked the talk, but I just didn't walk the walk. I was certainly a stockbroker, but only superficially, if you get my drift. End of chapter. Chapter 11. I start modeling in Chicago. By the time I quit the brokerage business, I had been hanging around with people in the modeling industry for several months during my nightlife hours, and I was ready to give it a try. I had by now learned enough about the business that I knew what I needed to do to get it rolling. The first thing that I needed to do was to get some model test shots done so that when I went to a model agency or a casting, I would have some pictures of me to present to them. It's imperative in the modeling business to have some professionally done photographs of yourself to show the powers to be just what you look like on film. So the first thing that I did was to run around and pay a few local photographers to take test shots of me. I have only one photo from those first test shots, but one is better than none. Then the next thing that was called for was for me to get an agent. That was also a must because that's where an ad agency or a company goes when they need a model. So my first choice was an agency called David & Lee, as I had heard that they were the best in Chicago. Plus my good friend Mike was represented by them. Well, that was to no avail because they turned me down, but the second one didn't. I sort of had the last laugh on that David & Lee rejection because almost right after getting an agent, I landed a modeling job that was cast and shot in the same building as David & Lee. They had sent some of their models too to the casting, but I got it, and I'd call that poetic justice. Wouldn't you agree? I've included that ad for speakers in this chapter. I will say that I had success right off the bat. Within just a couple of weeks, my image started to appear in full-page newspaper ads for the two largest retailers in Chicago, Sears and Webolt's. The guy at Sears actually told me he liked my look and that I could expect regular bookings from him. The important thing was that I was breaking into the modeling industry and getting some work. And not only was that experience invaluable to my modeling career, but I was also able to put those ads in my model portfolio so that when I went to a casting, I had what's known in the industry as tear sheets, real modeling jobs from magazines, newspapers, and the like in my portfolio instead of test shots. And it made me more credible as a model. Prospective clients could see a real work in a portfolio that way. They just take you more seriously. And I'll end with this, and it will sound redundant, but becoming a model was the key to this entire journey that I write about here because modeling allowed me to live and work all over the world, which is exactly what I did for most of the next 35 years. I've included some photos here, and that first photo is one of my first model test shots that I had paid a local photographer to take right when I got in the business. And then the next one is the ad that was shot in that same building as the model agency that turned me down. And the last one is a Webolt's ad that appeared in the Chicago Tribune on September 23rd, 1984. Go figure. End of chapter. Chapter 12. The Significance of Moving Downtown. In retrospect, my move from the suburbs to downtown Chicago when I got the Dean Witter job was actually more significant than getting the job itself. I never went anywhere with that job in that industry, but just by living in the city, I was exposed to things that I never would have been exposed to had I stayed in the suburbs, such as the modeling and acting industry. And being exposed to that industry would change the course of my life, as it was those after-hours downtown connections that got me in that business, which is what made possible my living overseas and in all of those fascinating places for most of the next 35 years. Because to move to a country with zero money, knowing no one and never having been there, one has to work. And modeling was one of the only jobs where you could just move to a foreign country and start working right away, which is precisely what I did. After I got the Dean Witter job and moved downtown, I was a stockbroker working in an office by day, but at night I'd hang out and prowl around and would eventually meet some people that would change my way of thinking and expose me to things that would change the course of my life forever. I really had two lives, my day life and my night life, and they were as different as, well, night and day. Go figure. One guy that I had met when I was out one night was a young guy in his early 20s from New York by the name of Bernard John. We called him BJ, and he was typical New York. He had that gift of gab with that New York confidence to it. He was one of a kind and a real go-getter. And oh, he was a great guy too. I loved you, BJ. I don't remember exactly how or where I met him, but he's the one who first introduced me to the modeling industry. He was one cool cat and a hell of a nice guy, and I'll never forget him. And if you ever happen to read this, BJ, I love you, man. I remember he had opened a club in the city called Mars Bar with zero money. There was a big old empty out-of-business nightclub that was just sitting there, and he somehow talked the owner into renting it to him, possibly with proceeds from his new club. No idea. I never asked him. Anyway, I know that he had zero money and that he opened up Mars Bar, so you tell me. He must have done one hell of a sell job, put it that way. BJ had all sorts of connections to the modeling industry, mostly in the form of attractive female models, and he used to have fashion shows at his club, and I did runway on a few of those shows just for fun, as I was still a stockbroker, and it was one hell of a great experience and one of my first exposures, my first exposure to that business. I mean, I was a stockbroker by day and doing runway by night, and I guarantee you no one watching those fashion shows could have ever guessed that I was actually a stockbroker. You know, there were also a bunch of models always hanging out with BJ, and in fact, I dated a few of them, and they taught me the ins and outs of the modeling business, such as getting a model portfolio together with test shots, getting an agent, and, you know, things that I did as soon as I quit my broker job. Hell, within a few weeks of quitting that last broker job, I was appearing in full-page ads in the Tribune as a Sears model. The entire course of my life is that within 6 months, I'd be living in Paris and working as a model. So it was the modeling itself that made it possible for me to live overseas in all those great places, such as Nice, Paris, Singapore, Hong Kong, and finally Thailand, where I still happen to live some 30 years later, all because of the fact that I got hired by Dean Witter and consequently moved to downtown Chicago. I also took my first acting classes during this period, and that would come in handy as well. The other interest that I picked up while living in the city was roller skating. As I had mentioned prior, I picked up skating while I was living in the city, and skating would become my absolute passion and favorite pastime for many years as I moved from country to country. Do you know that I skated almost every day in Paris, Singapore, New York, Hong Kong, and Bangkok? My roller skates became my best friend as I moved from place to place. I'm not kidding. Hell, I probably know every single damn park in Manhattan south of Central Park. I met my girlfriend Rika while skating Madison Avenue late one afternoon, and I also met my Nicaraguan wife while skating down Ocean Drive in South Beach one day. Anyway, that move to the city was the key that opened for me the door to the world. Go figure. I do have a screenshot of me skating down Fifth Avenue in New York as I was inadvertently caught skating during the filming of a New York telephone commercial one day, and I actually approached my agent and asked if they were allowed to film me and not pay me, and she said, in this case, yes. But my point is, I was always on my skates. End of chapter. Chapter 13, A Magical Trip to the Travel Agent. It was November of 1984, and I was getting a bit bored with Chicago and its gray November days, so I decided to take a little island-type vacation to St. Martin, as I'd been there the year prior and had loved it. So I headed on over to my travel agent, the one that I had used for my last trip to the Caribbean, and I asked her to quote me the price of a round-trip ticket to St. Martin, the same vacation that she had booked the year prior. And she quotes me a price nearly double what I had paid the last time. And I'm thinking, wow, are you kidding me? And I'm thinking about it, mulling it over, And then I noticed this small brochure sitting on her desk that read, Ski Innsbruck. And I pointed to it and I asked her, how much is that? I mean, hell, I'm a skier. And she tells me, $600 all included. So I say to her, okay, if you could book me on a flight tomorrow, I'll take it. I'm not sure why I gave her that sort of ultimatum, but you know me, I can be weird. And so she gets on the phone, does her thing, and a minute later says, okay, done, you're booked. And my life would change forever at that very moment just because of that little brochure sitting on that desk that day. You see, I would fly to Innsbruck, but not take that return flight back to Chicago. Instead, would hop on a train and head south, getting off in Nice, where I'd spend the next 6 months working as a model. From there, I would move to Paris, where I'd also work as a model, and from there to Singapore and work the same, then to New York to study acting and break into that business, then to Hong Kong, and then to Bangkok, working as a model and actor in every one of those fantastic and interesting places, and living a life beyond my wildest dreams. And all because St. Martin's price had doubled and that little brochure happened to be sitting on that desk. Coincidence? Nah. As I sit here in Thailand typing these words out some 35 years later, don't think I don't thank God every single day. And it all started with that magical trip to the travel agent. I've included a shot of me that was taken that prior year that I had vacationed in St. Martin. You'll notice the bandage on my forehead, and I got that when I tried to do one of those somersault turns you see in those swimming races on TV. But unfortunately, I cracked my head on a sort of cement ledge just below the water's surface, and I had to go to the hospital to get it sewn up. And when I got there, I told the staff to be sure to do a good job because I was a model, at night anyway. And I'll never forget that nurse shouting sort of excitedly in French, "Il est modèle! Il est modèle! He's a model! He's a model!" She took me seriously. I like that. End of chapter.